Tonight, the proposed ceasefire deal gets pushback from Hamas.
We are going to continue to push on an urgent basis with our partners, with Qatar, with Egypt, to try to close this deal.
The international fight to end Israel's war in Gaza. And
we don't want poll workers to make honest mistakes, and those mistakes become risks.
How some states are working to ensure a safe election come November. Plus, from inflation to interest rates, we'll break down all things on the American economy. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. A U.S.-backed ceasefire proposal between Israel and Hamas appears to be on the verge of collapse. Welcome to Faith Nation. From CBN Studio in Washington, I'm Tara Mergener. The White House says it will keep pushing Hamas to accept a ceasefire that could free Israeli hostages. The deal still hangs in the balance after the terror group made numerous changes to the current proposal. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the region this week and says the U.S. is working to bridge the gaps in Hamas's new demands.
Hamas cannot and will not be allowed to decide the future for this region and its people.
Meanwhile, an explosion of violence on Israel's northern border with Lebanon. Today, Hezbollah fired more than 200 rockets at the Jewish state, the Iranian-backed terror group vowing retaliation after the IDF killed one of its top commanders. Israel and Hezbollah have traded fire nearly every day since the October 7th attacks. But this sudden escalation is raising fears that more war is on the horizon. Back here in the U.S., some good news on the inflation front, says analysts. Prices did not rise in May, according to the latest government report on the Consumer Price Index. But inflation over the last year rose at 3.3%. That is still above the Fed Reserve's target rate of 2%. And in light of that inflation news, the Federal Reserve says there will be no interest rate cuts just yet. That means the benchmark rate will stay in the range of 5.25, that is, to 5.5%, the highest it has been in decades. Analysts had hoped for 3 cuts this year, and now forecasters predict we'll likely see 1 cut this fall. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said today the government needs more confidence that inflation is moving in the right direction.
If the economy remains solid and inflation persists, we're prepared to maintain the current target range for the federal funds rate as long as appropriate. If the labor market were to weaken unexpectedly, or if inflation were to fall more quickly than anticipated, we're prepared to respond.
All right, here with us now is Steve Skanke, Chief Economic Advisor at Keel Point. Welcome. Can you break this down? What does this decision mean for those of us with credit cards and mortgages, maybe a student loan debt?
Sure. Well, thanks. It's great to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity to come on with you. The good news, and Chairman Powell outlined that in his message, is that the inflation report this morning on CPI was actually more positive than they expected. The first 3 months of the year, inflation turned around and started going up again. Now last month it was down a little bit. This month it's down a little bit more. And that's actually good because inflation and higher prices disproportionately harm lower and middle income groups. Now, the consequence of their policy, of course, is that we do have restrictive interest rates. We have higher interest rates. And just as you said, the rate the banks charge one another, 5.25% to 5.5%, is curtailing activity. It gets reflected, as you pointed out, in our credit cards. It's one of the things, and inflation is another one of those things that has contributed to higher mortgage rates. Mm-hmm. But the rate at which prices are increasing has come down. Now, we all feel the pain of higher prices, higher prices are up since COVID, 20 to 25%. And that's just a burden on all of us.
Yeah, it's no doubt about it. It's a lot. It's a lot. Why is it so stubborn? Why is it so stubborn? And what's got to happen for it to come down more?
Well, part of it is just things working through the system. Last month, or I should say in April, reported in May, higher auto insurance costs were a big driver. And that was just sort of a catch-up. And then we had higher investment advisory fees. That really is a reflection of how well the stock market has done. And then housing costs have just been stubborn. New lease rates, if you're renting, have actually come down on average across the country. But how owners, if you own your own home, how the cost of that is calculated has been very stubborn in coming down.
But it's taking a long time.
It is taking a long time. But the really good news is that May, which got reported this morning for CPI, was a strong move in the right direction. And then the rate that the Fed pays most attention to, it's called the personal consumption expenditures deflator, which doesn't get reported till later in the month, but with CPI and then the producer price index that gets reported tomorrow, they can calculate that pretty well. That also looks to be a good number. And so that could come in the neighborhood of 2.5, which is getting very close to the Fed's target of 2% inflation based on
Steve,
that other rate.
Right. So obviously a lot of moving parts. We thank you for joining us. We are out of time, but we sure appreciate your insights. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. All right, less than 5 months from the presidential election, state officials are busy preparing for the voting process. According to one survey, a vast majority have increased security since 2020, hoping to ensure results can be trusted. The Pentagon is reaching out to higher education for help. National security correspondent Caitlin Burke brings us more on how students and researchers are testing the U.S. election system in order to prevent it from being breached. Caitlin.
Tara, in America, election equipment is considered critical infrastructure. Given its importance, the Defense Department enlisted a research team from 2 Maryland universities. Their task, a 3-year risk assessment focused specifically on the vulnerabilities of voting machines.
So we are looking at all the things that could possibly go wrong. Those could be an actor trying to disrupt something. Maybe, trying to break a machine or trying to vote for somebody that, who's dead or things like that. But they could also be honest mistakes.
Team member Dr. Natalie Scala of Towson University tells CBN News this is the perfect assignment for academia rather than government officials to tackle.
For academics, we look at it based purely on data, so we don't necessarily have a favorite candidate. We don't necessarily have an agenda to push. We just want that vote to stay the way it is. The moment somebody casts it, to the moment we count it, we want nothing to happen there. And what can we do to make sure that integrity stays there so the American people can have their votes counted?
The project's focus involves optical scanners used by 70% of voters and ballot marking devices used by the remaining 30%.
We are looking at it from the, the average American standpoint and making sure that you feel confident and secure in the processes that we have.
In the past, Scala's lab provided training for Maryland poll workers, a project she says will add to their current research.
We don't want poll workers to make honest mistakes, and those mistakes become risks, or problems. And we also want poll workers to be able to identify if something is going wrong.
This is the first of the lab's 3-year Pentagon grant. The team will consider cyber, physical, and insider threats, an overall approach that hopefully results in protecting other critical infrastructure like the power grid. Tara?
Caitlin, important information. Thank you. Well, turning now to the arrest of potential terrorists in several U.S. cities. 8 people suspected to have connections with ISIS are now in federal custody. Officials say the migrants are from the East Asian nation of Tajikistan. They illegally crossed the southern border last year, but were allowed to remain in this country. Authorities monitoring their activities discovered information that they might be linked to this terror group. They were detained in New York, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia. And while there's not enough evidence to charge them yet with terrorism, they will likely be deported. Coming up, Supreme Court justices secretly recorded what they said and why it is sparking backlash when Faith Nation returns. Welcome back. A federal judge strikes down a Florida law restricting doctors from providing gender transition treatment to minors. The law prevented them from prescribing puberty blockers and hormonal treatments to children, even with parental permission. The judge also blocked a requirement allowing only doctors to treat transgender adults. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis says the state will appeal that ruling. A Democratic activist and filmmaker posing as a conservative Catholic secretly records audio at events featuring members of the Supreme Court. Lauren Windsor's tapes include comments from Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Alito, and Justice Alito's wife. Critics say she baited the justices with her questions. Speaking with Justice Alito, Windsor notes a solution to division in this country is the right winning with morality, a notion the justice agreed with.
I think that the solution really is like winning the moral argument. Like, people in this country who believe in God have got to keep fighting for that, to return our country to a place of godliness.
Oh, I agree with you. I agree with you.
The Chief Justice was asked a similar question, but Chief Justice Roberts said it's not his job to put the nation on a more moral path. The head of the Supreme Court Historical Society, where the secret recordings took place, has issued a statement saying, quote, "We condemn the surreptitious recording of justices at this event, which is inconsistent with the entire spirit of the evening. Attendees are advised that discussion of current cases decided by this court or a justice's jurisprudence is strictly prohibited and may result in forfeiture of membership in the society." The Supreme Court has yet to comment. All right, Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council, joins us now for more. Tony, welcome. This woman, who describes herself as a documentary filmmaker and advocacy journalist, said she had no other way to report on the candid thoughts of the justices. Was this fair, and was what either Alito or Roberts said a problem in your mind?
Well, I mean, look, here's a news flash. Justice Alito is a religious conservative who has upheld the Constitution as it pertains to issues that come before him on the court. So let's go back to what he said for just a moment. Justice Alito did not say it was the court's job to bring the nation back to this godliness or this moral plane. He just agreed with the assertion that she made. So yes, it was a very leading question. What's interesting here, a couple things to consider, that when conservatives have done this undercover recording, if you will, David Daleiden, James O'Keefe, they found themselves in court that, in fact, David Daleiden had a $2.4 million judgment against him by Planned Parenthood for doing something very similar. So I think there's a, if you want to say double standard, kind of a double standard here. But also consider this. I believe there's an element of this. You have to look at the spiritual backlash that is taking place toward conservative justices that has occurred primarily since the leak of the Roe v. Wade or the Dobbs decision. And Justice Alito was the author of that opinion. This is designed to force either these justices to recuse themselves on certain cases that are coming before the court, or to, quite frankly, intimidate them into to silence and prohibit others from, or at least make others think twice, conservatives, before they get onto the court. Look, I think Justice Alito should keep doing what he's doing, and that is ruling according to the Constitution.
Tony, I'd like to get some quick thoughts on that Florida law blocking transgender kids from treatment that just got thrown out by a federal judge. What do you think?
The judge is off his rocker and should be off the bench. He equates gender dysphoria in the state treating minors with racial discrimination. This will be challenged, as Ron DeSantis says, and I believe the state of Florida will win on an appeal.
And Tony, I know you want to talk quickly about that Gallup poll. Tell me about that. We've got less than a minute left. It says Americans are evenly divided on abortion, gender identity, and other culture war topics, but veer right on economic issues. Quickly, what do you think of that?
When you dig down deeper, there's actually a Gallup poll and a Pew Research poll that show very similar trends, and that is the left is getting more liberal and conservatives on the right getting more conservative, especially when you look at Trump voters versus Biden voters. Clear divide in the country. The divide is getting larger, not smaller.
All right, we'll see what happens in November based on all this information we're getting and all these things happening. Tony Perkins, thanks so much for joining us. As always, we appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
All right, still ahead, reaching the next generation. See how these young people are working to bridge the gap between faith and politics. Welcome back. The Southern Baptists have officially rejected a constitutional ban on women pastors. The narrow vote marks the end of a 2-year dispute over church policy in America's largest Protestant denomination. Even without the constitutional change, the SBC's official doctrine still limits the role of pastor to men only. Critics of the ban say the SBC can already expel churches that allow female pastors and isn't necessary to enshrine that in the Constitution. The SBC has already excluded 7 churches over this issue, the latest being a Virginia church that was expelled yesterday. Last year, in a high-profile case, the denomination doubled down on its decision to exclude Saddleback Church for violating its doctrine. Well, much has been said about Generation Z, young people born between 1997 and 2013. Research shows the age group walking away from faith and church at a greater pace than the previous generation. Why? But it also indicates Gen Z is open to learning more about Jesus. CBN contributing correspondent Paul Pettit introduces us to a group of young adults in Arkansas determined to make an impact.
A basement full of young adults playing games and hanging out. Then, once the social time ends, they quickly get down to business, talking politics through a Christian worldview.
Politics matter because people matter. And so much of our generation wants nothing to do with politics. It's too divisive. It's too polarizing. But what we want to counter that narrative with is if our culture is so hyper-political, how can we help but bring the gospel, good news, into that bad news conversation?
For this Generation Z organization, that includes conversations around tough topics like abortion, gender identity, and same-sex marriage. Counteract USA started in Arkansas in 2021 and has expanded to more than 200 members, operating cell groups in 6 states.
We'd break down a topic like biblical marriage, and we say, okay, what does the world say? What is marriage? What does the world say that marriage is? How has our culture distorted that definition? What does the Word of God have to say about that? And how do we enter into the narrative? How do we change our culture to better reflect a biblical view of God's design for marriage?
The goal is evangelizing and advocating, such as peacefully demonstrating for life or preparing members to better discuss gender identity with a fellow student.
We're in Walmart, we see just like pride all over the place.
This meeting is focused on how to best respond to Pride Month.
It can be really easy to be swept away by those fleeting winds of doctrine. So Counteract for me has been a place where like-minded believers can come together and discuss really honestly what is being taught in culture and what we as believers are called to do about it.
The LGBTQ movement is looking for liberation in these sexual identities. They're trying to find their identity in sexuality and gender, but the only identity that can ever satisfy is a relationship with Jesus Christ.
I find myself, I'm more willing to talk about these things with my family. my cousins and have practiced and rehearsed these conversations and kind of just fleshed out the ideas to form what do I actually believe.
And Counteract USA couldn't be growing at a more pivotal time. Surveys from the Barna Group, a Christian research organization, shows that 82% of Gen Zers, who largely make up our college student body across America, either identify as non-Christians or nominal Christians. And the vast majority of those lean far left when it comes to culture and public policy.
If you don't have a firm foundation for a lot of these things, if you don't personalize your faith as a young Christian, then it's going to be not easy, but it's going to be more likely maybe that you're going to see a lot of young Christians continuing to fall away or flounder or falter in some of these conversations.
I had students who might have considered themselves a progressive Christian, a pro-abortion Christian, who have started to come to these meetings, who have had these conversations with people, and then within the year they say, okay, I can't help but vote in accordance to my biblical values.
Young Christians who were involved in these types of groups like Counteract, they're going to be pretty serious about things, and they're going to be pretty forceful about the ways that their faith should be affecting their viewpoints on politics and culture. And it's going to be really fascinating to see what that looks like in the years and decades ahead.
And if you ask these young adults, they'll tell you the future starts now.
Gen Z is ready for something different. The Christians in our generation, all they need to be is inspired, encouraged, equipped to actually go in and change their culture, and they will.
In Northwest Arkansas, Paul Petit, CBN News.
Finally tonight, this is fun. A Southern California family is living with an unexpected guest. The homeowners say a bear broke into the crawl space under their home in Monrovia more than a week ago. A neighbor says the bear, there he is a neighborhood local known as Samson, a big, lovable furball who has been in the area for years. But now, Samson has a hiding place.
We definitely have heard him going through the trash, and then last night he got into the trash and was dragging it under the house.
And that bear is tagged by wildlife officials, but police aren't going to do anything about it, saying the bear doesn't pose any danger to people. But for the Tate family expecting a baby soon, the bear is a little too close for comfort. The Tates plan to board up the crawl space the next time Samson leaves. Well, that's kind of a bummer. What a fun story. See you tomorrow.